Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for being here for today's lecture on the exhibition Volcano, Mount St. Helens in Art by Dr. Dawson Carr. I'm Brian Fariso, director of the museum, and to begin, I would like to recognize and honor the indigenous peoples of this region whose ancestral lands the museum now stands. These include the Willamette Tumwater, the Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Wallala Chinook peoples, the Tualatin Kalapua, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and many other Native communities who made their homes along the Columbia River. We also want to recognize today that Portland is a community of many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge the indigenous communities, past, present, and future, and are very grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence in our city. We also want to acknowledge the Cowlitz Indian tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand and Bands of the Yakima Nation, and their ancestors for whom Mount St. Helens has been a sacred place for generations. I would like to share a few accessibility announcements about today's program. T-coil headset and earbud-compatible assisted listening devices are available. We are using automated captioning, and I think it's working. Yes, very good, to provide real-time captioning. These captions can be viewed on stage by opening the URL pam.to/captions on your mobile web browser. Please see a staff member if you have any questions. We would like to acknowledge and thank our American Sign Language English interpreters, Amanda Hayes and Ashley Paul. For communication to work effectively, we ask that during the question and answer portion at the end of our program, that one person speak at a time and that you wait for a microphone to be passed to you. If you have any access needs that are not being met, please let a staff member know. Our museum has always felt that it is fundamental to our mission to be of our community and not just in it. And this exhibition celebrating Mount St. Helens reinforces our commitment to this responsibility. Mount St. Helens, along with other geographic landmarks that I know many of you know, including Mount Hood, the Columbia River Gorge, the Pacific Ocean, among many others, have for centuries defined and shaped us. Their presence and are constant reminders of our special place in the world, the significance of our natural surroundings, and our responsibility to be stewards of them, as well as kept us humble, given their enormity, beauty, and sublimity. The genesis of this exhibition came from a discussion over 5 years ago whereby the curatorial team laid out a vision to ensure the museum increased further its relevance. Interestingly, it became evident during these discussions that Dawson had an intense curiosity about our volcanoes that he undertook a multi-year exploration of artistic responses to them, zeroing in on this anniversary moment at one of the most dramatic events in modern-day history. I'm confident you will be visually and intellectually engaged by the range of creative responses to this majestic volcano and its eruption. A very special thank you for the realization of this project is needed for the William G. Gilmore Foundation, Nancy S. McGraw, the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, Dorothy Piacentini, the Ford Family Foundation, Anne Flowery, and the European and American Art Council of the Portland Art Museum, among others, all who have generously contributed to the exhibition. I would like to also acknowledge my late predecessor, John Buchanan, whose endowment fund is underwriting today's talk. Also, thank you to our primary community partners, the Mount St. Helens Institute, as well as the U.S. Geological Survey Cascades Volcano Observatory for sharing their knowledge in helping develop programs and learning opportunities for visitors. Our staff are to be acknowledged, and in particular, which are in addition to Dawson, are Stephanie Parrish, Don Urquhart, Matthew Juniper, and Michael Smith. For those who don't know, Dr. Dawson Carr is the Janet and Richard Geary Curator of European Art, joining the museum in January of 2013 as the first full-time curator of European painting and sculpture. He is responsible for the research, documentation, and interpretation of art made in Europe from antiquity to 1900. Over the past 7 years, he has organized several significant exhibitions for the museum, including Venice, the Golden Age of Art and Music, Gods and Heroes, Masterpieces from the École des Beaux-Arts, Paris, Rodin, The Human Experience, and reunited Francis Cuccio Gysi's St. John altarpiece. Dawson has also overseen 26 acquisitions for the European collection, notably Francesco Fidanza's Vesuvius Erupting, Giuseppe Bonito's Il Femminillo, and Philippe Derrickson's Portrait of Infanta Maria Anna de Austria. From 2003 to 2012, Dawson served as the curator of painting, Spanish and Italian paintings at the National Gallery in London. And from 1987 to 2003, as curator of the J. Paul Getty Museum. Dawson received his doctorate from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. He has written extensively on Italian and Spanish art of the Renaissance and Baroque periods, and is now, do I dare say, the foremost authority on volcanoes in art. Dr. Dawson Carr.
Thank you, Brian. Brian? You'll need it. Hold on to your hats, folks. It is true. I have been a volcano nut since I was a boy, growing up in flat, Florida. Just thinking, I was given one of those little kits where you mix baking soda and vinegar, and that did it. May the 18th, 1980 was one of the epic days in the history of the Pacific Northwest, at least in the modern history of the Pacific Northwest. And I know that probably most of you have stories and great memories of that day. The exhibition that just opened yesterday is the first survey of images of Mount St. Helens and related matters that's ever been undertaken. I have to say I was really surprised not to find a master's thesis or something like that had brought all of this imagery together. And just to start out, I want to mention two exhibitions that some of you may well remember. One was held in 1980, and it was announced after the first eruption of Mount St. Helens on March the 27th. It was the next day. The Portland Center for the Visual Arts jumped on the topic and announced an open exhibition. And so the exhibition was up when the great eruption occurred on May the 18th, 1980. 3 years later in Pullman at Washington State University, they did an exhibition that looked on artists' responses to the eruption. And I hope if we've achieved anything in doing this exhibition, it is in getting the basic images down so that in 10 years' time or whatever, someone can pick it up and run with it and do an even more comprehensive exhibition. I never got a chance to see it like this, but I know many of you remember it well. Volcanoes can make really beautiful mountains. And that's particularly true of stratovolcanoes like Mount St. Helens and like Mount Hood, volcanoes that are built up very slowly in layers or strata, so that they form these beautiful conical shapes rising majestically from the horizon. The triangle is one of the perfect geometric forms, and so these stratovolcanoes have attracted artists wherever volcanoes are located. There you see one of the earliest images of a volcano in Western art. It's Mount Vesuvius, and created early in the 1st century. And as you can see, let your eyes adjust, the slopes are dotted with vineyards. And there's Bacchus standing beside the mountain wearing a cloak of grapes. So, the rich volcanic soil is a great, great asset. And one thing that Native Americans have long known is that volcanoes do bring destruction, but after that, great regeneration. The depiction of volcanoes really got started later. Oh, I forgot to say the most important thing. And of course, this is a very, very special case, because here we have a beautifully preserved Roman fresco of the 1st century, and it's with us in this condition because it was buried by its subject. Representations of volcanoes erupting really emerged in the 17th century and then really took off in the 18th century with the phenomenon of the Grand Tour. People would normally come from Northern Europe and stop at Rome and turn around. But once Vesuvius started erupting, and in 1631 it began, it had essentially been quiet since the year 79, and it began a 300-year eruptive period that only ended in 1944, just as the Allied forces were getting to Naples. In the 18th century, people on the Grand Tour went down to Naples hoping to be able to witness a scene such as this represented by Volare. Here you see Volare creating a scene whereby people are fleeing the mountain across the Magdalena Bridge and all the way down. In the foreground, a monk holding an image of the patron saint of Naples, San Gennaro, the protector of Naples, and the faithful praying to God to stop this eruption. He produced a few of these in the early 1770s, and then quickly realized that that sort of image was not really what the milordi from England and the like, people on the Grand Tour, wanted to take home as a record of this experience. And this was the kind of image that predominated after the first few with people fleeing and the like, where you see people in awe at this great spectacle before them. This is a big thing. It's about 6 feet wide. And as you see here, the turbulent, violent, unpredictable volcano is juxtaposed with a serene moon, something that's constant and steady. Now, I want to introduce an idea to you, and it's about the sublime. Sublime used as a noun, not an adjective. We use the word sublime for everything today, from a performance, a vocal performance, a theatrical performance, and the like, a great play in sports. But the term in the 18th and 19th century really referred specifically to the sublime. And this was about our responses to the immensity or turbulence of nature. In art, the sublime is represented in works showing towering mountain ranges, majestic views, the vast night sky, as well as violent storms and avalanches, and, of course, erupting volcanoes. Events that induce terror, but simultaneously a feeling of awe at the grandeur of the event. So grand that they really overwhelm our comprehension. A feeling that really makes us small and puts us in our place as human beings. And this idea, of course, is explored in the imagery of Mount St. Helens much later. I wanted to mention our little eruption of Vesuvius. When I came here to interview, I told Brian with great, should never have done this on a job interview, but I couldn't believe the Portland Art Museum had these volcanoes on the horizon and no eruption of Vesuvius in the European collection. So we bought this early on, Francesco Fidanza's eruption of Vesuvius at night, and I want to point out two things about it. It's upstairs in the European galleries. You can go see it. And I want to point out two things. And the first is, you see the ridge around the cone of Vesuvius. And that is known as Monte Somma. And what it is the remnant of a much, much bigger Vesuvius that blew its top 50,000 years ago and changed global climate for some time. And I also want to point out here that Fidanza captures the phenomenon of the volcano ejecting volcanic bombs. These are great clots of molten lava ejected by the volcano, and they assume this aerodynamic shape in flight. And I point this out to you because you can go into the Brantley Gallery, into the Learning and Community Partnership space just off the Schnitzer Court, and touch a volcanic bomb that was ejected by Mount St. Helens. Thanks very much to the Mount St. Helens Institute for making that possible. It wasn't just Vesuvius. Frederick Irwin Church, the great American landscape painter, went to South America, to Ecuador, to paint Cotopaxi. Cotopaxi is a mammoth volcano, almost 20,000 feet tall, and erupts with some regularity, forming this great cone. And when he got back to his studio in New York, he painted this work. It's about 5 feet wide. And when it was first shown in 1862 in New York, every one of the critics, the local critics, interpreted it in the same way. And that was as an allegory of the Civil War, then raging. The volcano darkening the sun, but with the promise that the sun will shine brightly again. It wasn't just in the West. There are quite a few prints of the eruption of Mount Bondi in Japan in 1888. This was a volcanic eruption that killed hundreds of people. And you can see a house flying through the air on the left side. And all the way up into our time with Andy Warhol doing a wonderful series of screen prints of Vesuvius. As Brian told you, Mount St. Helens has been sacred to Native Americans for time immemorial. All of the tribes who lived within eyesight have stories about the mountain. And it's particularly sacred, of course, to the Cowlitz people, because it's the great landmark of their ancestral lands. They visit the volcano to commune with this great supernatural force. There are many, many stories depending on the tribe, and I was told by a representative of the Cowlitz people that even their elders don't agree on the stories about Mount St. Helens. There are many stories, but they all share one thing in common, and that is viewing the volcano as a living, supernatural presence on the landscape, one that they visit to commune with the creator spirit. Again, volcanoes bring destruction, but also creation as well. Some of the stories, here we have Mount Hood in the foreground, and from left to right, St. Helens, Rainier, and Adams. Some of the stories about this make Mount St. Helens feminine. In other stories, it's male. In one version of the stories, Rainier is the husband and St. Helens is the wife, and they spit fire back and forth at each other. In other stories, Mount St. Helens is one of a number of wives all fighting with each other. And it goes on and on from there. The one thing that Native Americans didn't do was depict Mount St. Helens. There was no need. It would never have even occurred to them because it was this living force on the landscape. And so we commemorate them with a panel, and you should go and read it through in full, about the relationship, particularly of the Cowlitz people to the mountain. And we represent Native American art by bringing out some objects from our collection that are made of the stuff of volcano, the substance of volcanoes, in this case, basalt, that upper layer that's laid down. And depending on the amount of gas and mineral content of the lava, the basalt can look very different. One thing that I did not understand, the Condor Bowl is one of my favorite things and has been since I first visited this museum, but I did not understand how amazing these objects are until I started working on this show. Henry James Ware was the first person, as far as we know, to depict Mount St. Helens. And he visited the area in 1845. He was a British spy sent to the Oregon Territory to try to determine if the British could win a war against the Americans for the territory. Before his party got back to Britain, it was all settled. It was all settled with the Oregon Treaty of 1846 and establishing the 49th parallel as the division between British and American lands. But his visit happened to coincide with an event, a volcanic event that you see here, of a volcano venting smoke and ash from the north side. And that is, of course, the side that was blown away in 1980. 2 years later, Paul Kane visited the area. Paul Kane is an artist and ethnographer, and he was mainly interested in recording Native American life and customs, but he as well witnessed the volcano erupting from a vent on the north side. He went back to Toronto and made this oil painting. Of course, he studied it by day, but he depicts it by night, remembering works like this. He'd done a tour of Italy. He knew such representations very well, and so he painted this nocturnal scene. The Turks in the foreground of the Fidanza, here replaced with Native Americans in canoes. Following these very early views of Mount St. Helens, you'll find a number of paintings depicting the mountain by early Portland artists, and I have time to only show you a few. This is Cleveland Rockwell. Rockwell was a lovely artist, but also a surveyor. He was sent here by the U.S. Coastal Survey to map the mouth of the Columbia. He then later mapped most of the lower reaches of the Columbia, as well as the Willamette, making travel to and from Portland safer. And he created this really lovely watercolor. Eliza Barkus, a really fascinating character. She established a studio here in Portland and was very active and prolific for many years, supporting her family after her husband died. And I'm going to show you just one more from this very early epic by Portland artists. And this is just an exquisite painting by Grace Russell Fountain. Visitors to the area also portrayed Mount St. Helens. Here you have the great American landscape painter Albert Bierstadt portraying the mountain. And I wanted to show you this. This was something that we couldn't bring for you to see, but because Childe Hassam is so connected with Portland and with this institution, visiting Portland to see his great friend C.E.S. Wood, one of our founders, in 1904 and 1908. And he made this lovely watercolor of the mountain rising above the low clouds. And the reason it's not here is that the donor, Grenville Winthrop, he left it to Harvard, his alma mater, along with a vast collection. And Mr. Winthrop was one of the great, great collectors of his time, but he was not an immensely generous man, lending during his time. And he did allow for the possibility that his works be lent, but only if the borrower paid one of his charities $100,000 for the loan. So that's why it's not here. Greta Allen was a Bostonian who visited the area and created this lovely view from somewhere up in the Northwest Hills. If any of you recognize that chimney, I wish you'd tell me so I can pinpoint the site. Great thanks to Randy Daigle for this lovely loan. And Clara Jane Stevens. Clara Jane Stevens is one of the great Impressionist artists of the Pacific Northwest. She was born in Land's End, England, down at the tip of Cornwall, and immigrated as a child to the Portland area, going back, training on the East Coast. And she became quite well known as an Impressionist painter, not just showing here, but all up and down the West Coast and in New York as well, getting rave reviews every time she showed. And this depiction of Mount St. Helens that so poignantly introduces the blight of human infrastructure on the once pristine landscape. And I wanted to show you Clara Jane Stevens because in 1916, she taught children's classes at the Portland Art Museum, and the following year, she was named to the faculty of the Museum Art School where she worked until she retired in 1938. One thing that I should tell you, as I let you take this in, is that the pre-1980 depictions of Mount St. Helens are few and far between compared with representations of Mount Hood. And the only thing that I can think about this is that Portlanders, we were the great population center, more greatly identified with the mountain they could easily visit. It was much tougher to get to Mount St. Helens. And therefore, I mean, we're talking about a factor of maybe 10 or more times images. And I did learn from the collectors who've so generously loaned us their pictures that, yes, indeed, when images of Mount St. Helens come up by early Portland artists, they tend to go for more because they're simply more rare. And I want to go back to this just for a second, and I want to make a thank you because the first section of the exhibition, we knew about the institutional loans from the Royal Ontario Museum, the American Antiquarian Society, the Historical Society across the street, but most of these images of Mount St. Helens are in private hands, and the real curator of that portion of the show was Mark Humpel. Mark has great knowledge of this material, and I cannot tell you how much he helped me, and I am very grateful to him for that help. Those of you who don't know Mark has a gallery in Selwood, Mark Humpel Fine Art. Now, back to the eruption. In opposition to the period before 1980, Mount St. Helens never got so much attention from artists until it blew. And then it started getting quite a bit. Hank Pander has been Portland's history painter for more than 50 years now. And he was born in Haarlem in the Netherlands and emigrated here, married a Portland girl, and settled down. And when the mountain blew, he was completely taken with it. And he's one of the Portland artists who made it a long-lasting subject in his art, both the eruptions and the aftermath. He described it as being, for him, about as un-Dutch as it gets, so, which is, of course, true. This wonderful painting normally resides in a conference room in City Hall, so very few people get to see it. And we're very grateful to the Regional Arts and Culture Council for having it cleaned. After almost 40 years, it needed it. It had a natural resin varnish that was beginning to yellow a bit. And it's luminous, wonderful best now up in the galleries. This is not the eruption of May 18th, 1980. It is the eruption on July 22nd, 1980, when the great eruption plume was seen against a beautiful blue summer sky. You'll find the sketch made from life for this upstairs on a very large watercolor that Hank did that day and used as a basis for this painting. Hank is very interested in the interaction between nature and technology. And he depicts these devices of observation on the table in the foreground, including this little miniature television set. And for those of you who were around in 1980, you'll remember these were all the rage. Something brand new. I mean, kids look at this today and laugh, but all the rage at the time. And it's a beautiful expression of our need to take an event so grand and overwhelming and threatening, and reduce it down to human scale. And so he has the antenna connecting with the eruption plume, and down it goes and reduces this grandiose scene to 2.5 by 2.5 inches. The streaks that you see across the sky are clouds. The only photograph I could find was from later in the day, where you see those clouds dissipating. Going back a little bit, this is the eruption of May 18th, 1980, very late in the day when the eruption plume died down and blew the smoke and ash northwest, made from Sauvie Island, again, done from life. Very different, the work of Barbara Noah, who, you should read her statement on her label. That you should go and take a good look at. But it is a painting that demonstrates our need to personify something so big as a malevolent force, but also quasi-comical as well in this wonderful image from 1981. Barbara's a Seattle-based artist. And Lucinda Parker made this work in 1980, July of 1980, very specifically. She calls it Magma Opus, and it was a sketch for a mural at PSU, and she didn't win the competition. It wasn't specifically a competition for a mural about Mount St. Helens, but she gave this to her husband the following Christmas, referring to it as the champagne version. The cork is popped. The other Portland, and I should say here, you'll find Lucinda's freshly finished large 8-foot and a bit painting up in the Schnitzer Court. The other Portland artist who was profoundly affected by the eruption was George Johansen. George had been teaching at the museum's art school for 25 years in 1980, and he really wanted to retire, to concentrate on his art, and he was looking for a sign that it was okay to retire. And when the mountain blew, that was the sign. And George made the erupting volcano a leitmotif. Any depiction of Portland, virtually any depiction of Portland that he's done since, has included the erupting volcano. And he made this work in 1980, and those of you who know George, it's absolutely a self-portrait as a baby, as if reborn in retirement with the volcano erupting behind. Also made that same year, this portrait of his wife, Phyllis. Phyllis was really a cat lady. She's the one who developed the scheme that's now been adopted around the world of trap, neuter, and release for feral cats. Again, there's the volcano erupting away, cats leaping about. And you're going to find a small section upstairs devoted to George's works. And this one, entitled Departure, is one of the objects that closed the show, made in 2007, painted on ceramic tiles, much like his mural, his great panorama of Portland, in the Multnomah County Library. And here George just has a wonderful time with the shape of that eruption plume, echoing it in the hot air balloons, the paddle of the kayaker, and the jets of water from the tugboat. Seattle artist Ryan Molenkamp is the only artist I know of who capitalized on the sequential photographs made by those who witnessed the eruption from all too close. And he entitles it Vancouver, Vancouver, This Is It. Those were the last words of volcanologist David A. Johnson, who was stationed on Coldwater Ridge and was the first to die in the eruption. That was his call on the radio to the USGS headquarters in Vancouver. Now I'm going to show you something that I couldn't find. This is a wonderful work by the renowned Roger Brown, one of the Chicago imagists. And I had a lot of help, including from some people in this audience, but also from the Roger Brown Study Center at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's just dropped out of sight. Hopefully the show might bring it out into the open once again. But it's marvelous. And Brown gives it this wry title. He loved to comment on human reactions to great natural events. And in this case, he calls it the first continental eruption. And of course, it was anything but the first eruption of Mount St. Helens, much less all the other volcanoes along the Pacific coast. However, it was the first that had been witnessed by European settlers here. And here you find two great apartment towers with various reactions in the window, people in the landscape, and this very stylized eruption of Mount St. Helens. You know this artist. This is hanging on the staircase just outside here, heading up to the Hoffman entrance. You know his vocabulary very well. And so I hope this comes from out of the woodwork at some point. We tried really hard. The other work that I couldn't find, made in 1980, is by a local artist who passed away last year, Judith Parks and Fox, who was a weaver. And she created this work about the fracturing of the mountain and the light on the day of the eruption, May 18th, 1980, Portland, Oregon. The aftermath of the eruption was most brilliantly treated in photographs. Photography was the ideal medium. It can simultaneously depict vast vistas and fine detail and minute variations in light. And black and white photography was even more ideal for the subject because, of course, the lush green and blue of the landscape became monochrome after the eruption. This is directly in the blast zone where the Earth was scoured. Emmett Gowan is one of the preeminent American landscape photographers of our time. Julia Dolan did a show in 2015 of his works, and in 1980, he had a fellowship from the state of Washington to depict sites in the state, and of course, once the volcano erupted, he got sidetracked from all the other things that he had planned to do. Initially, the zone around the mountain was off limits, and so photographers took to the air, as you see here. A brilliant photograph capturing the effect of the ash fall and mud flows. There you see the ash and mud-laden Toutle River. This is one of ours. This is one Julia bought back in 2015, all but abstract. And you're looking at the confluence of the Cowlitz and the Columbia here, with the Cowlitz 4 years after the eruption, still laden with ash. And directly above this, upstairs, you'll find another photograph taken from a much greater distance of this site 24 hours later, when the ash flow patterns had completely changed. Now, Mount St. Helens ash is 65% silica. And so glass artists, very quickly in this case, tried to use it in making their works. This beautiful vase, now in the Tacoma Art Museum, was blown the night of the eruption. Paul Morioni and his friend, another great glass artist, Rob Adamson, drove immediately when they heard about the ash fall. They got in the car and drove to Eastern Washington, gathered up a barrel of the stuff, and headed back, and Paul blew this beautiful vase that night. Mount St. Helens glass is made by taking the ash and fusing it at 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit when it becomes volcanic glass, and it's very green. That little vase is one of the only ones I know about that you could really qualify as works of art. However, glass studios here and in Seattle created these ash trays cast from pure Mount St. Helens ash, and the Glass Eye Studio in Seattle is still incorporating a little Mount St. Helens ash in all of the glass that it makes. They used it as they realized it helped establish and maintain the studio, and so it was a great marketing technique. These fused Christmas ornaments are one of their biggest sellers. These were about to be thrown away, and Paul Morioni saw them in the studio and realized a really lovely little sculpture had been created. The other great photographer who was drawn to Mount St. Helens was Frank Gohlke. And both he and Gowan created photographic essays about Mount St. Helens over the next decade, for which they are renowned today. Here you see the mountain bifurcated by this low cloud, not unsimilar to that beautiful watercolor of Child Hossam we saw earlier. And in the foreground, the blowdown of trees. The blowdown of trees was one of the things that most compelled artists, most grabbed their attention. And we've got a whole section of photographs of the blowdown of trees, and it centers on this work from our collection by Chuck Arnoldi. If you know Arnoldi's art, you know that it more often looks like this. Real twigs, highly colored, very strongly colored, and diaphanous. Pierced, you can always see through them. And of course, the character of this is completely different. And it was because the artist saw these photographs of the blowdown of trees and was really moved by them. And here, in a kind of diptych, you see they're split pieces of wood split apart, and on the left-hand side, charred, as if charred, and on the right, as if ash-laden. There are two of the wonderful images of the blowdown, these created by Marilyn Bridges. There are four of these up there. They belong to us, and we're delighted to have them. If you are acquainted with Marilyn Bridges, chances are it is from her depictions of the Nazca lines in Peru, for which she became famous, just done a couple of years before the Mount St. Helens photos. And here, Diane Cook and Len Jensel, husband and wife team. You know their work very well. They're often on the pages of National Geographic, as well as many other magazines. And they happened to visit just after a snowfall dusted the logs on Spirit Lake. And here, Frank Golke again, with the blowdown near Fawn Lake, looking like a cascade of trees. There, you get the idea. Now, lest anyone thinks that those are twigs floating on Spirit Lake, we introduced this wonderful shot by Buzzy Sullivan, a young photographer who's picked up the mantle from Gowan and Golke and continues to return to the mountain and be inspired by the things he sees there. When Hank showed me this, I was really taken with it. Being a fan of Ursula K. Le Guin, I first read one of her speculative fiction novels back in college. And she's particularly known for her works of fantasy and science fiction. And she was a great friend of Hank's. And in October of 1981, they managed to finagle an early pass into the red zone, and they visited it together, along with the photographer Ron Cronin, and this work was the result, a 50-inch wide, spectacular drawing of Ursula Le Guin reaching out as if stunned by this experience. And for those of you who know Le Guin's work, she has a fantastic imagination, and it's directed at describing very different forms of life on other worlds. And so for this drawing, Hank introduced a depiction of the sixth moon of Saturn, Enceladus, one of the most fascinating objects in the solar system, only 300 miles apart, but one of the brightest because it's covered with ice. And at the time of their visit, or just before a bit, Voyager 2 was sending back the first close-up images of the moon. Since that time, the Cassini spacecraft made an even closer approach and was able to fly through one of the ice geysers emanating from the surface of Enceladus. We now know that these geysers create one of the rings of Saturn, and they detected salt water. And scientists have been able to determine that under the ice there's this vast underground ocean of salt water. And so scientists are, of course, imagining primitive life forms existing in this. So even though it was appropriate for Ursula Le Guin in 1981, it's even more appropriate today. Along with this, I'm not going to show you any of them, but I'm going to entice you to go up and really see them yourself. I read in Ursula Le Guin's wonderful essay, Coming Back to the Lady. She referred to Mount St. Helens as the Lady, and she was more than a bit obsessed with it. But I learned from that essay that she made pastels and drawings of Mount St. Helens. And so I called Theo Downes Le Guin, her son, and I'm very grateful, and all of us have to be very grateful to Theo for lending us a few of these. They've never been shown before, and so those are part of the exhibition as well. The last room of the exhibition deals with Mount St. Helens as an active landscape, a landscape that is ever changing. And this photograph was made in the crater by Frank Gohlke in 1980. And you see the volcano off-gassing on the left. And here, he happened to snap the shutter just as this rock fall created these rooster tails of dust. Brad Johnson was a longtime resident of Portland, one of the founders of Second Story, whose interactive video kiosk that normally resides at the Learning Center up on top of Coldwater Ridge, which you can access in the learning space upstairs. Brad moved to Trout Lake a while back, and he's very close to Mount St. Helens and has become really taken with it, and he visits it often. And the basis of this work is a photograph that he made in the crater, or maybe in Lewitt Canyon, just adjacent. And over it, he has applied Gompi paper and molded it into this shape. And I went to see him out in Trout Lake, thanks to Stephanie Parrish, who's a friend of his. She introduced us. And I went to see a very different kind of work, but this drew me across the studio. And I looked at it and I thought, well, it's a volcano turned on its head in the crater. And then I thought, no, it's an eruption plume emanating out from the crater. One of the great symbols of strength and stability in art is the pyramid, so it turned on its head again. A funnel. And you're going to love this because the old master guy didn't get the reference. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll come back to that. Just for context, because most of you know this work of Brad's, the Ponderosa pelts permanently installed in the Moda Tower. And there's Brad working on them in his studio, and you can see why he calls them pelts. This is the kind of thing that I went to see, photographs based on his experience of the crater, but the photos alone were never enough for Brad, and so he manipulated them into these collages that he then superimposed washes and the like over. Okay, I'm going to show you what this is based on. Some of you already know who visited the exhibition. It's Botticelli's Map of Hell, based on Dante's description in the Inferno. Your position in hell was determined by how heinous your sins were. And down at the bottom, all funneled to Lucifer himself. I love this work, obviously. And since Brad created it, he's moved on. I've forgotten to tell you. It's entitled Mount St. Helens Thin Place, based on the Celtic idea that there were spots on the earth where the barrier between our world and the underworld were very, very thin. And Brad is continuing this series. This is another work he's created since the one that we have on show, Mount St. Helens Thin Place Tychomagnetic Anomaly. Do any of you get the source? This is how they find the great obelisk. It's putting out these anomalies and how they find the great obelisk in 2001, A Space Odyssey. We'll wait to see what Brad does next. This last room of the exhibition treats some of the beautiful new landscapes that were created by the eruption. Lewitt Falls didn't exist before the eruption. And I love this photograph. When I showed it to Julia Dolan, she said, "Oh gosh, Buzzy's being like Ansel Adams here," and it's true. It is a very profoundly beautiful and moving image, black and white, except for that one patch of green. And here we are, barely a mile from the crater, and life is returning. Buzzy's mentor is Frank Goelke, and Goelke came back and visited Mount St. Helens again and again, and in this diptych shows the regrowth that occurred over 9 years since he was last back on that spot. Cook and Jensel, as well, visited in 2009 and captured this Roosevelt elk herd. I love the colors of the elk against the colors of the landscape. And I decided to borrow this picture from Buzzy. He's made more dramatic images of the mountain, but I thought it was an important one to show because it depicts the North Fork of the Toutle through smoke from the Diamond Creek wildfire that was started by a careless camper to illustrate that volcanoes are not the only ones that destroy landscapes. And finally, Cameron Martin's Remission. Cameron Martin was born and raised in Seattle. He's been living in Brooklyn now for quite a few years. He's the head of the painting department at the Bard Graduate Center. And he created this work, 11 feet wide, in 2006. He told me it's still the largest work he ever did. He knew the mountain well. He was 10 when it blew, and in a purely visual way, he expresses the instability of the mountain. And when you view it from a distance, the mountain has substance, presence. But as you walk up to this canvas, the black shifts to read as void. So your eye really can never resolve it. And it's in this way that he expresses that Mount St. Helens is an unstable place and that it will change again. As you see from the title, he likens it to a human body with an incurable disease that might return at any moment without notice. And so it is a real lesson for us. I'll close now, but I want to make a few thank yous of my own. Because I ended up working so far out of my area, this exhibition started as a general overview of volcano imagery and world art. And when it dawned on me that the 40th anniversary of the eruption was fast approaching, I went to Brian and we quickly determined to shift to do the more relevant show for our museum. But being someone who works on very old art, I'm happiest in the 17th century, and so I've never done serious work on a living artist, and it has been a marvelous experience getting to know these artists, and so I thank them very much, and I thank the collectors who parted with these works and made it possible for you to enjoy them. And I just remembering another aside. Sorry, folks, my brain is tired. I wanted to tell you that Emmett Gowan's photographs that you see upstairs, all 20 of them in the white frames that he prefers, all of those come from Emmett's own collection, and they've only been shown once before, to my knowledge. And so they are in beautiful, beautiful condition, and he's been very, very generous to us, as well as Golke and all the other artists and collectors. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the curatorial department. Because I was working so far outside my comfort zone, I really leaned on them, and they were, as they always are, incredibly generous. And so, to Grace Cook Anderson, the Schnitzer Curator of Northwest Art, and to her predecessor, Bonnie Lang Malcolmson, I say very great thanks. To Sarah Krajewski, the Eichholz Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, who held my hands through looking at a lot of the images that ended up in the show, including this one. To Mary Chapin, the Curator of Graphic Arts, who is always a wonderful sounding board. But most especially, thank you to Dr. Julia Dolan, the Minor White Curator of Photography, for reasons that will be obvious to you when you see the show. Julia knows most of the photographers in the show, and one of the reasons that Emmett Gowan trusted us with his own photographs was not me, but Julia. And so thank you very much to Julia. To Don Urquhart, our Director of Collections and Exhibitions, who manages budgets and just was open to all kinds of wild suggestions. And finally, I want to thank Brian Fariso for making it possible for this curator to retire with a bang. Thank you. Enjoy the show. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I've gone almost an hour here, although about halfway through I was wondering if we weren't going to be here at 4. And I'm happy to take questions. Please wait for the microphones to reach you. Raise your hands if you've got a question. And do remember that I'm not a volcanologist.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. Anybody?
I love you. Thank you. I've left you speechless.
Yes. Maybe we should go see
Thank
the show.
you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go enjoy the show.